me move into my presentation. So I've entitled this, How to Maximize Energy Content in Forage Grasses. And I'm going to talk about it a couple of different ways. A lot of it will be, what does the energy content in the grass matter for the grass as far as the grass growth, but also how does it affect your animal performance. Some of the things I'll talk about, I don't have real hard advice to give to you as far as how much more production are you going to get from your beef per acre for having a higher sugar content, but I hope to give you some new perspectives to think about. In fact, let me just ask you, okay, how much energy is in this piece of wood? Okay, now I mean energy. If we threw this in the fireplace, would we get warm? Okay, there's a lot of energy in here. A lot of it is carbohydrates, but it's structural carbohydrates. So cellulose and hemicellulose. There's also a lot of lignin that we know is not digestible. So if we crunched this up or made it into sawdust and fed it to the animals, they wouldn't get much nutrition because of all that lignin that ties up the availability of the cellulose and hemicellulose. And there's very little non-structural carbohydrates in this piece of wood, sugars. Okay, but this does have energy. Okay, I was going to bring you a piece of mature Johnson grass that's sitting out in the field. I didn't get around to that. But let me ask you another question. Oh, Roy Burst did say if you made this into sawdust and you fed it to a cow, it would give a little bit of scratch factor, a little bit helping the rumen to work, but they wouldn't get any food out of it. You'd have to give them a supplement. So don't try that at home. Keep this for your fireplace. Okay, I did find some fescue when I was driving here today. How much energy is in this stockpiled fescue? Okay, if you're listening to Chris's presentation, you heard that this might be 15-16% crude protein. 60 at this time of the year, it might even still be 60% or more TDN. So you've got a lot of energy for the animal to gain weight. Now I'm going to talk some about the sugar content or the non-structural carbohydrate content. So you probably don't do this much in your pasture, but you can pick up a stem, start chewing on it yourself. Maybe you're a little bit hungry out there. So, and it tastes a bit sweet. It tastes a little bit grassy too. But in the base of this stem, okay, if I took this whole material right now and I looked at what's the sugar content, it would probably be about 15% of the weight of the plant would be sugar. Okay, it'd be glucose and sucrose and fructose. There'd be a little bit of a storage carbohydrate called fructans. It'd be about like you're drinking a can of pop. You have that high fructose corn syrup. Now that would be in the whole forage material. When I chew on the base of this stem, where carbohydrates are being stored for the grass to grow back, it might be 40% sugar content or non-structural carbohydrates. So we've got a lot of energy in our forage. Just our typical TDN type energy, but I'm going to talk a lot more about those non-structural carbohydrates, those readily available energy sources. So if you find yourself lost in the woods, you break your leg, nobody's around, there's no food around, but you can find a little bit of stockpiled fescue, and you pull up some of these in the winter and start chewing on it, you could probably survive a few more days just on that. Now, again, don't do that unless you're have broken your leg out in the wilderness. And the other thing is probably don't try that when you're about to give a talk, because the little fibers are kind of stick between your teeth. So if I start choking, someone do the Heimlich on me. Okay, we all know that we're defoliating our pastures. Cattle are eating the pastures. What does the plant need for regrowth? Many of you have seen this slide in my Master Cattlemen presentation. Okay, it needs energy to grow back. The plant needs energy to grow back. Okay, the energy, where does it come from? Okay, it's coming from the sun. Where else? What's that? Okay, the roots are taking up water. They're taking up minerals. Those are needed for the energy. Sun shining down on the grass. Carbon dioxide is being taken up from the air. Water is being taken up. Those are combined together to make carbohydrates. And I'll give a little more detail on that in a minute. But the big thing is the leaf area remaining, because that's what's going to soak up the sunlight. But also the stored carbohydrates in the base of the stem. In red clover alfalfa, here's an alfalfa plant. You've got carbohydrates in the root system that are going to allow regrowth. So in the spring of the year, we dug this plant up a couple of weeks ago. It's going to grow back from carbohydrates right here. Your grasses, okay, grasses, this one here I dug up with a little bit of roots on it. Grasses don't store carbohydrates in the roots. It's in the base of the stem, that part that I was chewing on. Okay, that's where it's going to grow back in the spring. So that's one reason not to graze too close, particularly during the growing season, so you've got some carbohydrates for growth to come back. Even this time of the year, if you say, I want my pasture to grow back as quick as possible in the spring, then you're better off not to take it down to the ground or take it down real close. Now, if your goal is to do some overseeding, to put clover into that pasture, and you take it down close, then that's going to slow down the growth in the spring of your grass. That's going to help the clover to get started. But if your goal is to get the pasture coming back quickest, then maintaining those carbohydrates in the base are really important. Okay, think about your pastures as solar collectors, but you're not having to go out and spend a bunch of money for the solar collector. You've got it there. You just got to do a little bit of management. So here's photosynthesis. Here's that process. Okay, you've got carbon dioxide and water. So carbon dioxide for free from the air, water for free from the ground, coming in the plant. Those are combined together with light inside the chloroplast in the plant, and you've got sugar produced. So first those simple sugars, the sucrose, the fructose, the glucose, and then you've got to build up a more complex carbohydrates, and then the structural carbohydrates, and oxygen's given off. So simple process. I mean, it's more complicated chemically, but really a pretty neat process. So which side, the left or the right, in that pasture is a better solar collector? Okay, you got more growth. Now, obviously, you've got to eat that growth sometimes so your cattle gain weight. But if you eat it into the ground or repeatedly eat it into the ground, you're reducing that solar collector. If you don't allow it to build back up, you're really hurting your pasture growth. And another important point, I'm going to tie all this in with just how sugars develop in the plants in a little bit, is respiration. Energy stored in carbohydrates is released in a controlled manner. So sugar or other carbohydrates in the plant plus oxygen inside the mitochondria in the cell, and then you have energy produced. And you have carbon dioxide given off, water given off, and energy produced. So you think about it. The grass right now isn't growing very much. Well, I take that back. With the kind of weather we're having, maybe it is growing just a little bit. But most times it's not growing in the winter, but it's still got to survive, so it's going to be slowly burning off some of the energy just to survive. And then you get in the spring, and the top leaves have burned back from the cold weather or from grazing. The way that plant's going to grow is respiration kicks in. The carbohydrates are being burned off, the plant's starting to grow. And until it gets some leaves there, it won't have photosynthesis kicking in. And at night, your pastures, the only way for them to survive and continue to grow is through burning off some of that in respiration. Okay, so here's a taprooted legume like the alfalfa. Okay, the carbohydrates are coming from the taproot. Okay, they drop with that initial growth. They pick back up as the plant gets taller, and then you cut or graze. So that's why we say with those taprooted legumes like alfalfa, red clover, let them get up to a late bud, early bloom stage so this cycle can occur. Because the first couple of weeks, you've got a drop of carbohydrates in that root system, and then you've got a building up of carbohydrates as you have enough leaf area to not only allow the plant to grow, but to put some storage carbohydrates. So that tap-rooted legume, if you continue to graze it, that red clover that you put into your pasture, if you don't give it a rest period, the carbohydrates aren't able to build back up, and the plant weakens. Now, I'm not going to talk much more about the legumes now. I'm going to talk mainly about grasses, but no, that's what's happening in those tap-rooted legumes. The main growth is from the stored carbohydrates in the roots, and then you allow the plant to get big enough to build those back up before you graze or cut again. Okay, in grasses, our main point is trying to maintain leaf area to keep that process going, to keep that energy or those carbohydrates to be produced. Many of you have seen this slide in different presentations, but I'll just show it again. And I'm going to just compare for you two different orchard grass plants. The one on the left is going to represent continuous grazing. The one on the right will represent rotational grazing. And we took a photograph every 20 minutes over a period of 5 days. Every so often the plant jumps because it continues to grow overnight. Okay, so which pasture would you rather have? The one on the left, the one on the right? Okay, obviously the one on the right, you've got a lot more growth, a lot quicker growth. The only difference in those two plants, they were both in excellent shape coming out of the greenhouse, big tall growth. We cut them both back at the beginning of the month. The one on the left we cut back to 1 inch tall, like you turn an animal in and it grazes a plant like orchard grass that's really palatable down close. The one on the right we cut to 3.5 inches. And then every week for the rest of the month we came back to this plant and we cut it again. Okay, kind of like a cow in a pasture is going to go back to those areas that they've grazed before that have that new really succulent growth before they're going to go to this kind of tall growing fescue or other plants. So if you can give a rest period to allow the leaf area to build back up, and if you don't take off the base of that stem where the carbohydrates are, you've got a lot quicker regrowth. And that's why in this publication on rotational grazing that you got out here, I don't have it in front of me, but it gives a chart of when to start grazing, when to stop grazing, and a lot of that has to do with being able to maintain those carbohydrates in the plant. Okay, now, all of that was a bit of background for maintaining carbohydrates with leaf area with grasses, with giving sufficient rest period for the tap-rooted legumes. That's kind of an entry into talking a bit more about carbohydrates in the plant and how that relates into animal production. Okay, again, if we think about a plant is made up of proteins, lipids or fats, nucleic acids like the DNA of the plant, vitamins and minerals, and carbohydrates. The carbohydrates are the most abundant organic molecules in nature. They're required by the plant for regrowth, like we talked about, those sugars, necessary for plant maintenance and development. You've got, as I mentioned before, you've got structural carbohydrates that give the strength to the plant. They're the components of the plant cell wall. They provide the structural support. They're the cellulose and hemicellulose. Michael talked about how the rumen microbes break down those structural carbohydrates. That's the real beauty of a ruminant animal. It can break down those structural carbohydrates. But I'm going to talk mainly right now about non-structural carbohydrates. That's those sugars. That would be starch and something like alfalfa. They make, use, transport, and store energy in the plant. They're also readily available energy. Chewing on the base of this plant, I was getting pretty high concentration of sucrose and fructose and glucose. Just had a little bit of a grassy taste to it. But cattle love that grassy taste. That adds to the flavor for them. Okay, so non-structural carbohydrates, glucose, fructose, sucrose. You've also got starch, and you've got fructan. So fructan would be a longer chain fructose, so more of a storage type. Okay, all of those together, so all of those are readily available energy. You need to think about it, you get a potato, it's mainly starch. You eat it, you get a lot of energy. There's a lot of starch in the root of a legume, of a taprooted legume plant. Okay, and that's what we call TNC, total non-structural carbohydrates, readily available energy sources. Water-soluble carbohydrates, okay, if I chopped up these plants and I put them in water and left them for a day, the water-soluble carbohydrates will dissolve in the water. In fact, we can make a grass tea, I guess, if we wanted to, and get some energy off of it. So that's glucose, fructose, sucrose, and fructans. So you don't have starch in the water-soluble carbohydrates. So if, for example, some labs, you can ask them when they do your forage quality analysis to also tell you the WSC, the water-soluble carbohydrates. Okay, I'm giving you these terms partly just for information, but also as I show them on my graphs later on, you know what I'm talking about. Okay, but cool season grasses, okay, the fescue, the orchard grass, the bluegrass, they don't accumulate starch except in the seed. So for the rest of this talk, the WSC, the water-soluble carbohydrates, the TNC, they're really the same thing. Both of those terms would give about the same number in cool season grasses because you don't have starch, or at least almost no starch in that plant material. Okay, if you look at the cross-section of a plant leaf, so the insides of the plant, that's where the chloroplasts are for photosynthesis. That's where the cell contents are. That's where those sugars are located, these non-structural carbohydrates. But around the plant cell, you've got the cell wall. That does take more to break down. We don't break down the cell wall. When we eat salad for supper, we're getting a little bit of energy out of the juice of those lettuce leaves. We're mainly getting fiber in our system that's just going to kind of flow through our system to help our digestion, but we're not going to get energy out of it. Okay, let me go a little further with the non-structural carbohydrates. So what I'm saying is these are those carbohydrates that are high energy in the grass plant. And I'm going to give more detail on these benefits as I get toward the end of the presentation. But you can have increased animal preference with grasses that have a higher sugar content or higher content of these non-structural carbohydrates. Increased intake, increased animal gains. So we've already talked about how they're essential for plant growth. They supply energy to the animal. I'm going to give you some data from a research study. Horses can be sensitive to high levels of these non-structural carbohydrates. This is the only thing I really mentioned about horses. But if a horse is eating a grass plant that's really high in these non-structural carbohydrates, these sugars and those fructans, horses, remember, they're not ruminants. So they're initially starting digestion in just their regular stomach. And then they break down fiber in their hindgut. So rather than having a rumen first, breaking down the fiber, the horse is at the end. So if horses get too much sugar, it gets to the hindgut. It causes a number of issues, but it's called, particularly there's acidosis or lower pH, leading to poor circulation. Poor circulation into the hoof leads to hoof problems, and laminitis is kind of the symptom of that. I won't go into all the details, but you get into lameness with horses, even to the point of having to put a horse down if they get separation of that hoof so that they're completely lame and can't get around. Fortunately, in ruminant animals, rarely is this an issue for them on pasture. Now, in feed yards or dairy cattle that are getting a real high energy ration and are on a hard surface, you get into hoof problems. Many of you probably know of that. But fortunately, as I'm talking about grazing cattle on pastures, we're glad to have high levels of non-structural carbohydrates because it's high energy. Okay, that energy content, that non-structural carbohydrate content, it varies based on the forage species or the variety, the maturity of the plant, how you're cutting or mowing or grazing, your fertilizer application, the environment, how much water, how much nutrients, the temperature, the light intensity, even seasonally, even day-night cycles. So a lot of factors that go into that. I'm going to talk to you about how you relate that into management, but a lot of it we don't have a whole lot of control over, but it is good still to understand what's happening in the plant. Okay, I'm going to explain to you a bit of detail, or show you a bit of detail from a research project that my graduate student Kelly Prince just finished up with. So show you some data here, actually in central Kentucky. Okay, she took 4 different cool season grasses. Kentucky bluegrass, orchard grass, perennial ryegrass, and tall fescue. 2 to 3 varieties of each. She added nitrogen, or another treatment she didn't add any nitrogen. And where she added nitrogen, she gave some in mid-March, mid-May, there mid-August, kind of like the time that you'd be stockpiling fescue or other grasses. She harvested 12 different times, 2 to 4 week intervals. It was mowed every 2 weeks to keep the plants vegetative, keep it in a vegetative state, because we wanted to say, what is the sugar content or the non-structural carbohydrate content of this leafy grass material that you would have if you were grazing on a pasture. And she sampled in the morning, she sampled in the afternoon. Now, this project was actually funded through money that we have as part of our collaborative agreement with the USDA. And one of our main focuses for doing this work was looking at low sugar grasses and high sugar grasses. It was funded from really an equine study. Okay, I said a minute ago, horses, you don't want the really high sugar content, but at least horses that are prone to laminitis. But I've told Kelly all along, her background is equine. I said, well, Kelly, I think that cattle producers can learn a whole lot from this because they want to look for those grasses that have a higher sugar content because of that readily available energy. So again, as I said, I'm going to talk to this from the standpoint of how do we get the higher content. So all the way from mid-April through to early November, this material was harvested. Here's an example, because we planted all those different varieties. You can see where we had the nitrogen addition with the better growth here. And quite a detailed study. Clipping every 2 weeks, putting it in liquid nitrogen because we didn't want any of the sugars to deteriorate or to be burned off while we waited. You're going to lose some of these sugars when you're making hay. As the grass dries, the plant's going to still use up some. So we froze it right away. Then we kept it on dry ice, put it in the freeze dryer. So the contents that I'm showing you were the contents from the fresh grass. Ground it, used lab procedures to test it. We also calibrated the NIR so we could do a lot more samples. But I'm going to focus more on the information that we got from it. Okay, so this is what we got over the season. So in the spring of the year, when the grass is growing rapidly, we've got carbohydrate contents. So this would be those sugars and the fructans. Here, 10 to 12%. Some cases it was as high as 16 to 18% of the weight of the plant were these non-structural carbohydrates. Now, you remember Chris said earlier about cool season grasses, and their best growth temperatures is about 70 degrees. So they're most efficient at growing at about 70 degrees. So here in early May, we're getting cool at night. We're probably not getting much above the 70s in the daytime. Perfect growth conditions. Perfect conditions for these cool season grasses to take in sunlight, to put that into sugars, to put that into growth. Okay, what happened then in the summer? Why did it drop down? Okay, cool season grasses, when it gets into the 80s, when it gets into the 90s, they're still producing sugars in the daytime, but they're burning off a lot just to maintain, just their growth and just their status. So it drops a lot in the summer. Okay, I'm talking about cool season grasses. The benefit of planting Bermuda grass or crabgrass or sorghum sudan grass or even corn is that it's very efficient with photosynthesis during the summer. So it's going to continue to produce sugars over the summer. But most of our pastures are made up of cool season grasses, so this is what's happened in the summer. It picks back up again in the fall. You can have, in late fall, that sugar content in your fescue, as I commented earlier when I was chewing on a piece of it, might be 20%, 15 to 20%, even higher in the base, because the plants are growing slower. You've still got photosynthesis happening. You don't have as much sugar being burned off. Okay, but notice the other thing on this graph. I'm showing you the bottom line is the morning. The top line is the carbohydrate content in the evening, in the afternoon. Okay, why is it lower in the morning than in the afternoon? Okay, no photosynthesis in the dark. There's no sunlight. So the grass is using up carbohydrates just to survive. And like you saw in that orchard grass, it's still growing a little bit. So almost universally, you're going to have higher in the afternoon than you're going to have in the morning. But it's interesting. You look at this particular day right here, July 8th. It so happens that that was a very cloudy day, and we didn't have much buildup of carbohydrates during the day because there wasn't as much photosynthesis. We go over here to September 15th, that they were pretty close together. What happened then, it was a very cool night. So the carbohydrates were maintained kind of like they were in the refrigerator overnight. So you didn't have them burn off overnight. So, a lot of the variation is very sensitive to the environmental conditions. Okay, which grass has the highest levels of those readily available carbohydrates? This is over the whole season, averaged over all the measurements that we took. Perennial ryegrass was highest, followed by tall fescue, followed by Kentucky bluegrass, followed by orchard grass. The different letters signify that those were significant differences based on statistics. So you look at this, you might say, well, I want my cattle to have that high sugar content, to have a little bit more energy. I'm going to plant perennial ryegrass. Okay, you'll notice Krista even mentioned that when he talked about different forages, because it only lives about 2 years in Kentucky. So in the North Island of New Zealand, in Europe, perennial ryegrass does great because they don't have the hot summers. So you could plant perennial ryegrass if you're willing to replant it every couple of years. And some dairy farms in Kentucky that are putting their milking herd on pasture will plant it. But fortunately, tall fescue maintains quite high levels. Bluegrass does as well. Orchard grass is still a very good forage, but those readily available sugars, or high energy sugars, it's on the low end. Okay, the nitrogen response. Okay, I don't have to be the one to tell you that nitrogen makes grass grow better, but if you didn't believe me, or you didn't believe that picture Chris showed, this is the height of the plant. The average over the whole season was always taller where we added nitrogen on every one of these grasses. Now, again, you kind of know that. I didn't have to tell you that. But how does nitrogen affect that sugar content in the grass? Again, just another graph showing that nitrogen content over the whole season. But where we added nitrogen, we always had taller plants than where we didn't. But the surprising thing is that when you add nitrogen, the plant grows better. At least here with Kentucky bluegrass and perennial ryegrass, where we didn't add nitrogen, we had higher carbohydrates. Now, before we started this study, I would have told you, well, there's going to be more carbohydrates. Where you add nitrogen, the plant's growing better. Okay, but when the plant's growing better, it's using carbohydrates for that growth. It's also producing more protein, which is displacing some of the carbohydrates. Kelly gave a talk to a meeting couple of months ago, our Kentucky grazing school, and she said if you don't want really high levels, then, if you want high levels, then don't fertilize. But if you don't fertilize, you're going to get less growth. And so the little bits of difference in carbohydrates here, the added nitrogen and the added growth are going to way outweigh any differences in carbohydrates. And after, this was just a couple of weeks after we'd applied nitrogen. Once we got it a few more weeks later, the nitrogen was incorporated. We had no real difference in carbohydrate content, but where we'd applied nitrogen, we had even better growth. But I would much rather in your pastures that you get nitrogen from clover than adding it because of those benefits Michael talked about and that free nitrogen. But obviously nitrogen can be very effective. Okay, now bear with me, a lot of data, but I'm going to point out a couple of things here that I'm going to highlight. The lowest levels of those non-structural carbohydrates were in orchard grass in the morning. The highest levels were in a couple of these perennial ryegrass varieties, particularly this Aberzest, in the afternoon. That's kind of what I've told you already. Here's the later part of the year. That first was just in the spring and early summer. Again, orchard grass were the lowest. Perennial ryegrass was the highest. Some of the fescues were also high. Okay, this is just another slide showing that added benefit of the carbohydrate buildup during the daytime. So every one of the varieties that we had over all of the different forages, the water-soluble carbohydrates were higher in the afternoon than they were in the morning. Okay, now you may say that's a lot of science and physiology, and what does that have to do with cattle production? Should I worry about that? Does it make any difference? Hopefully I convince you it does make a difference for the grass to grow faster, but does it make a difference for cattle production? And there's not actually a whole lot of information on how these soluble carbohydrates have to do with cattle production, because we're looking at more the overall carbohydrates, including the cellulose and hemicellulose. But a couple of interesting bits of data let me show you. Okay, in Utah they did a study. They had 8 different tall fescue varieties. They looked at the cattle preference. When they turned them into plots, kind of like those plots I showed you that Kelly had earlier, and they looked at a 0 means that the animals didn't graze that plot. A 10 means they ate it all. And over each month, over 2 years, look at something like Kenhai, actually a fescue developed in the University of Kentucky a few years ago. Okay, every time they were put into that paddock, they were eating a good portion of that Kenhai. 6, 7, 8, almost 9 out of 10, meaning they ate it all. You go down here to Mozark. Okay, they were hardly eating any of that Mozark tall fescue. A couple of times they ate a bit more, but in most cases they weren't eating very much. Now, Kentucky 31 was kind of in the middle. It wasn't lowest, it wasn't highest. Okay, you can't really see these numbers, but the point I want to make is the relationship of what they liked versus what they didn't like was correlated or related to the carbohydrate content, the non-structural carbohydrate content. And, maybe that shouldn't be surprising. If you put us into a room and you had candy bars on the table, or you had kale, and you said, choose what you want. Now, some of us may be really healthy, and we just go and grab that kale and start stuffing it into our mouth, but most of us would probably grab the candy bars. It's sweeter, we like it better, maybe we need an energy boost. Cattle aren't different. They're going to like something that's a little higher energy content. So they preferred that, they went toward that. Now you say, well, I don't really care whether my cattle preferred it or not, I want to know, do they gain more or not? Really nice study was done in Argentina. Gregorini and others, and they put beef heifers, they turn them in the morning, they turn them in at 3 in the afternoon. When they turn them in at 3 in the afternoon, and you'll see more details on this in the proceedings, they had a 0.3 pound per day gain once they had been in there, once they had been doing this rotation for 3 weeks. This is in the late winter. They actually had close to 1 pound a day added gain, turning them in the afternoon than in the morning. Now this was annual ryegrass, a very high energy grass. Their total gain probably would have been, Glenn, 3 pounds per day on that fresh annual ryegrass. Okay, and why did they gain more weight? Was it because they liked it more? Well, that wasn't the reason, because it was all annual ryegrass. It wasn't different varieties. But what they ended up showing, because they measured when the animals ate more. In fact, I think I've got, I'll show that to you in the next slide. So here's the difference in the carbohydrates from 7 in the morning. This is 1 in the afternoon. This is 7 in the afternoon. But they went from, they had about a 5% increase in that carbohydrate content as they went through the day, both in the spring and in the winter and in the spring. And then they went and looked at what were the animals doing when they turned them in. I'm not going to try to explain this graph in detail, but this is how much they were eating, how much bites they were taking. And they found that when they turned the animals in the afternoon, these dark colors here for the afternoon cattle sorry for this slipping back and forth. They were eating more, they were taking more bites, they were grazing for a longer period of time, plus they had the added carbohydrate content. Their conclusion was not that the bit higher sugar made them gain a lot more weight, but they were consuming more right there when they were first put in. Okay, let me just make one more comment here. Okay, what does all this mean? Okay, one simple thing, if you're trying to decide, when do I open up a new paddock? I've got a cool season grass. I want to put something you talked about into practice. When would be a better time to turn animals in to a new paddock? Morning or afternoon? Okay, afternoon, they're going to get a bit higher sugar. They're probably going to eat more of it. Now, I don't know how much difference that's going to make in Kentucky. I'm giving you some examples. We hope to learn more about this over coming years. Spring of the year. One of the reasons we get such good compensatory gain is we not only have really lush grass that's not very fibrous, but we've got that higher non-structural carbohydrate content. You may decide with different varieties or different species that you plant. You may want to plant one that's a higher carbohydrate content. That's one of the things we really like about the novel endophyte tall fescues, is they don't cause the toxicity. They've got a good just regular quality, but they're also good in that non-structural carbohydrate content. Okay, the last slide is when you look at a whole range of different cool season grasses, there's also a range in that carbohydrate content. But those that I just showed you, even when you look at this table with a lot more, we got perennial ryegrass on top, we've got fescue orchard grass here in the middle, and some are even lower. Okay, I'm going to give you a couple of conclusion statements, but again, the proceedings gives more detail on those things I talked about. So, non-structural carbohydrates are produced by photosynthesis. Their levels vary based on all those things I talked about: species, variety, management, season, time of day. At the University of Kentucky, we showed that we had a difference with the perennial rye highest, orchard grass lowest. Other studies, as I just mentioned, have shown things like improved animal preference, increased intake, increased animal gains. A lot of people helped with that research I showed you that Kelly did. I want to particularly thank the USDA and thank all the people that worked on that. And here's some people that worked on that project. So questions you have for me, and then we'll take a few minutes if there's questions for Chris or Michael. So any questions you have for what I've talked about? Yes, sir.
Can you mix the novel with the infant fescue?
So can you plant the novel into the existing Kentucky 31? The limitation, in theory, it'd be great to have half Kentucky 31 and half novel, but Kentucky 31, since it's pretty aggressive, and once it's established, it's hard to get the novel established in it. So we really believe you're better off if you're going to plant novel and you're going to pay $4 a pound per seed to go ahead and get rid of your Kentucky 31, so then you have no toxicity issues and plant just the novel. You're better if you've got Kentucky 31 to add clover into it, get that added protein, get the isoflavones, get that free nitrogen, than trying to mix the two together. So your success rate would be much lower trying to add it into an existing stand. And I'm asked that a lot, but that's kind of where we're at now with that. Any other questions? Yeah, Austin.
On this stuff you just talked about where they're turned in the afternoon, things like that. I just read real quick, it says it's in a winter grazing period. Do you think those results will be the same here during summer grazing as far as the afternoon turnout, where they were more active in that afternoon?
Well, I don't know exactly, but you did see that even in the summer, the carbohydrate levels were lower on Kelly's study, but they were still higher in the afternoon than they were in the morning.
Well, I was just looking at the grazing activity part of it, where they're going to be hotter in the later parts of the afternoon.
Oh yeah, no, good point, Austin. So yeah, temperature in the animal and the stress of the animal would make a difference. So could suppress it. Yeah, good point with that. Yeah.
After a freeze, supposedly sugars are higher. Is that because the plant is not using as much right after a freeze?
When you get frost conditions, you get a buildup of carbohydrates because it's so cool, so they're not being burned off. You don't really have more produced, but you're having them more concentrated. Yeah, good question. Yes, sir. Really good question. And those people in Utah that did all that work, they showed in their climate that an afternoon cut hay had a higher sugar content and was more preferred by animals than a morning cut. But they had a big advantage. They're growing hay under irrigation, so they never worry about it getting rained on. They're at a high elevation, so it's getting down in the middle of the summer to 45 at night, so the plant's not burning off sugar overnight. In Kentucky, we've not done a controlled study, but we know in Kentucky, particularly you get a summer like this and nighttime temperatures are in the 70s, that we'd get, if you cut in the afternoon, you get a lot of that burned off overnight, plus you would have lost a whole day of drying conditions. So in our mind, in Kentucky, in theory, maybe yes, maybe in the spring, but the thing is, cut in the morning when you got a whole day to dry is going to be better for us.
But if you've got good weather conditions, it'll be better.
Well, if you had good weather conditions and the night was cool, then that could be an advantage if you know you've got that much time ahead. And they've shown that in Utah, as long as we have those kind of conditions, yeah. Okay, are there any, we've got just a few more minutes, so any questions you have for Michael in talking about the isoflavones in red clover? Okay, what about any questions for Chris? Okay, Michael's talk and Chris's talk, a lot of detail in your proceedings, so I encourage you to look at that. If you want to get an extra one of these to take back to somebody, there's extra copies out here. Encourage you to do that.